The execution was supposed to be routine, just another afternoon during the bloodiest weeks of the French Revolution. Another cart, another group of prisoners, another fall of the blade. But something happened on July 17th, 1794 that Paris had never seen before, and within 10 days, the most powerful man in France would be dead. What if I told you that one execution meant to intimidate a nation may have helped bring down the Reign of Terror itself? By the end of this story, you'll understand why historians still debate whether the deaths of 16 Carmelite nuns marked the psychological breaking point of revolutionary France. This isn't legend or religious exaggeration, it's documented history. And the twist at the end, what happened just 10 days later, changes how you see the entire terror. But to understand why their deaths mattered, you need to understand what France had become by the summer of 1794. By then, the guillotine was no longer shocking. It was infrastructure. The revolution had promised liberty, equality, and fraternity, but in its most extreme phase, known as the Great Terror, it delivered suspicion, tribunals, and mass executions. The Revolutionary Tribunal no longer functioned like a court. It functioned like a conveyor belt. Trials were short, evidence was optional. The law of 22 Prioral had eliminated meaningful defense. A person accused of counter-revolutionary thought faced two possible outcomes: acquittal or death, and acquittals were rare. At the center of this machinery stood Maximilien Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety. They believed terror was necessary to preserve virtue. They believed fear could purify the Republic, and for months it seemed untouchable. Thousands were executed: aristocrats, priests, former allies, even revolutionaries themselves. The blade fell so often that the sound of it became ordinary. And then came 16 women who were never supposed to matter. The Carmelite community of Compiègne had already survived almost a year in hiding. When the revolution abolished religious orders in 1790, declaring all vows null, most communities dissolved. These women did not. They quietly divided into small groups, rented apartments across the town, wore civilian clothes, and continued praying together in secret. They weren't organizing rebellions. They weren't smuggling weapons. Their crime was persistence. They believed some commitments were higher than politics. On June 21st, 1794, agents raided their apartments simultaneously. They searched for proof of illegal religious activity and found it: devotional items, royalist sympathies, evidence they had continued functioning as a community. In the climate of the terror, that was enough. 16 were arrested. 3 were away visiting family and escaped. The arrested sisters were transferred to Paris to stand trial. Now here's where the story takes a subtle but powerful turn. Because their civilian clothing was unavailable at the time of transfer, officials forced them to travel to Paris in their Carmelite habits: brown wool robes, white veils. In a city where religious life had been outlawed, they arrived dressed as what they were. That image mattered. They were held in the conciergerie, the antechamber of death. Most prisoners stayed 1 or 2 nights before execution. The nuns stayed 5. During that time, they recanted the civic oath they had been pressured to take years earlier. They understood the risk. They were not naive. They knew the statistics. By that summer, the public prosecutor had already sent more than 2,000 people to the guillotine. Their trial on July 17th was swift. The charges included fanaticism and counter-revolutionary sentiment. When asked to define fanaticism, one of the sisters calmly forced the prosecutor to clarify that their religious devotion itself constituted the crime. There was no dramatic defense, no political speech, just quiet composure. The verdict was predetermined. All 16 were sentenced to death that same afternoon. Executions during the terror were designed as public theater. Prisoners were transported in wooden carts through crowded streets. The journey was intentionally slow so citizens could witness the consequences of disloyalty. Crowds usually jeered. They shouted insults. They treated it as spectacle. But something different happened that day. As the carts rolled through Paris, the nuns began to sing. At first, it was the Miserere, a psalm of penitence, then hymns they had recited together for years in their cloister. Their voices rose above the rumble of wheels on cobblestones, and slowly, witnesses reported, the noise of the crowd began to fade. The jeering diminished. The usual roar softened into something else: silence. Think about that for a moment. In the most violent, desensitized desensitized phase of the revolution, a city accustomed to death grew quiet, not because of force, not because of soldiers, but because 16 condemned women were singing. When they arrived at the Place du Trône Renversé, the guillotine stood ready. Between June and late July, more than 1,000 people had been executed at that location. Efficiency was the goal. Each execution took less than a minute. The sisters formed a line. One by one, they approached their prioress, Mother Teresa of St. Augustine, and asked permission to die. That detail alone unsettled many observers. They were not dragged, they were not pleading, they were requesting. The youngest, Sister Constance, went first. She renewed her vows at the top of the scaffold. The blade fell. The singing continued. Now, with one fewer voice, 16 became 15. 15 became 14. With each drop of the blade, the hymn grew softer. Witnesses described the eerie effect, a living choir gradually diminishing into silence. The crowd did not cheer. No mocking, no celebration, just stillness. And here's where the psychological impact deepens. The terror depended on fear. It depended on the idea that the state could break anyone. But what happens when the condemned appear unbroken? What happens when death does not produce panic but conviction? By the time Mother Teresa ascended last, she had watched 15 of her companions die. She renewed her vows clearly, composed. The blade fell for the 16th time. The bodies were buried in a mass grave. If this were only a tragic story of martyrdom, it would already be haunting. But the real shock comes next. 10 days later, on July 27th, 1794, Robespierre was arrested by members of the National Convention. The following day, he was executed by the same guillotine. The Reign of Terror collapsed almost overnight. The Revolutionary Tribunal was dismantled. Executions slowed dramatically. Now, historians debate causation carefully. Political dynamics, factional struggles, and fear among Robespierre's colleagues all played roles. Correlation does not automatically mean causation, but perception matters in politics. And multiple contemporary accounts noted that the execution of the singing nuns disturbed even hardened revolutionaries. In a system built on intimidation, their composure felt destabilizing. In a culture saturated with blood, their calm created contrast, and contrast forces reflection. Some French Catholics believe their deaths broke the fever of violence consuming the nation. Others argue it symbolized how far the revolution had drifted from its original ideals. Either way, the execution did not strengthen the terror's authority. It exposed its moral exhaustion. There's another layer here that makes this moment so powerful. Revolutions often devour their own legitimacy. They begin with high ideals, but when fear becomes the primary tool of governance, cracks appear. The execution of 16 unarmed, devout women did not look like justice. It looked like overreach, and overreach changes public psychology. When Robespierre fell, many citizens were ready. The silence that had descended during the nuns' procession felt, in retrospect, like a turning tide. Not loud protest, not riots, just a subtle withdrawal of emotional support. Power can survive opposition. It struggles to survive quiet doubt. More than 2 centuries later, the story continued to echo. In 1906, Pope Pius X beatified the 16 martyrs, formally recognizing them within the Catholic Church. And in December 2024, Pope Francis declared them saints through equipollent canonization, affirming their enduring spiritual legacy. But regardless of religious perspective, the historical question remains fascinating. Can a single event accelerate the collapse of a regime? Can moral conviction undermine political terror? History suggests it can, because the terror did not end with a massive uprising in the streets. It ended when insiders decided it had gone too far. And sometimes what convinces insiders is not military defeat, but moral discomfort. Imagine standing in that crowd on July 17th, 1794. You've watched dozens of executions before. You've cheered, you've shouted, you've convinced yourself it's necessary for the Republic. And then 16 women begin to sing as they walk toward death. No hatred, no panic, just conviction. Would that image stay with you? Would it make you question? The French Revolution promised liberty, equality, fraternity, but during its darkest hour, it revealed how fragile those words become when fear overrides principle. And ironically, it
It was a group of cloistered nuns, politically powerless, socially marginalized, already condemned, who demonstrated a form of strength the state could not manufacture. Their execution was meant to erase them. Instead, it immortalized them. And here's the lesson that feels almost uncomfortably relevant today. Systems built purely on fear eventually collapse under their own intensity. When authority relies only on intimidation, it creates moments of moral clarity that expose its weakness. The silence of Paris that afternoon may not have been rebellion, but it was recognition. Recognition that something sacred had been crossed. Recognition that power had overstepped. Recognition that perhaps the revolution was no longer protecting freedom, but consuming it. 10 days later, the blade that silenced 16 voices fell on the architect of the terror himself. History doesn't always offer poetic symmetry, but sometimes it comes close. If this story shifted how you see the French Revolution, if it made you question the simple narratives of heroes and villains, then you're exactly why this channel exists. Because history isn't just dates and names, it's human psychology, moral tension, and the moments that quietly change everything.
Every week, we dive into the hidden turning points that textbooks summarize but rarely explore. The decisions that seemed small, the events that looked routine, the silences that signaled transformation. So if you want more stories that challenge assumptions and uncover the psychological forces behind history's biggest shifts, make sure you subscribe right now. Join a community that looks beyond the surface and asks the harder questions, because next time, we're uncovering another moment where power believed it was invincible right before it collapsed. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's keep uncovering the turning points that changed the world.